I'm not a professional archaeologist. I drive a truck. And the things that I'm saying here are intended to be first steps towards rethinking some things that have long been held to be fundamental parts of Marxist dogma, but um, I actually think a lot of it is Stalinist distortions of Marxism. So that have kind of crept into even good revolutionaries fall back on some of this other stuff. So this is meant to be not only revisiting a lot of that stuff, but also looking at some of the taking into account some of the new archaeology that's been happening, and it is astounding. I'll get into it in a second. And I will also say that in order to keep this under 3 hours long, I had to omit a lot of the fun, cool stuff. So in the discussion, if people have questions, there's lots of examples about stuff that's literally being discovered as we speak. Um, so first off, why are a bunch of revolutionaries spending an evening talking about archaeology when the world is the way it is? We've got wars, we've got genocide, we've got famines, we've got environmental degradation, we've got bigotry on the rise, and nascent fascist movements being nurtured by the richest and most powerful people on the planet. Why are we doing this? Well, it's part of the project of convincing people that the world has not always been this way and can be different. Anybody who's ever had a conversation about the state of the world always gets asked, well, isn't this always the way we were? Didn't we evolve to be like this? The manosphere on social media is filled with this kind of BS about alpha males and nonsense like that. News, social media, schools, churches, entertainment, these ideas are out there and being pushed constantly and more and more. And it's not just conservatives and reactionaries. Liberals and even some radicals can push these ideas as well. As much as I love Star Trek, its overarching narrative is always that humans are basically bloodthirsty savages, but only civilization and color-coordinated suits can keep that at bay. Um, Fortunately, those arguments happen to be not just bad, not just morally wrong, but false scientifically. Um, and we can now demonstrate conclusively that humans lived in conditions of equality and cooperation for about a quarter of a million years. And not only that, but the previous 2 to 3 million years were spent evolving towards that. But given the divisions in our global society, class, gender, nation, race, etc., new discoveries about our past mean that these questions keep getting rehashed over and over again. Um, so the second reason is that the pace of these discoveries has been increasing rapidly. We're now what I would say at the beginning of a golden age of archaeology. There are new techniques and technologies, DNA analysis, ground penetrating radar, LIDAR, means that even very robust Marxist explanations for the rise of class societies are facing serious challenges and questions. Those are good things. Um, but if we're going to be good Marxists, we have to follow that and keep up with it. Otherwise, we risk just reciting old dogmas that scientists have moved on from. Um, so while Marxist and quasi-Marxist ideas used to hold a decent amount of clout in archaeology studies, that's no longer the case. And the void is being filled by a hodgepodge of ideas that recycle some of the worst tropes about development, colonialism, imperialism, gender, war, sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes and increasingly explicitly. If we're going to be able to hold our ground um, and convince large numbers of people that Marxism can credibly explain a world, then we have to do the hard work of updating our theories to account for new discoveries. Um, and fortunately, I think that these new discoveries make a greater case for the Marxist understanding of history and human society, even if we have to challenge and discard some of the things that very good Marxists and even Marx and Engels themselves wrote and thought. So first, to start off, some definitions. Some people might define these differently, but these are the ones I'm going to use for working, or I want people to think about tonight. First, Marxism. This is Marxism and the origins of class. So Marxism. People may know that a synonym often used is historical materialism or dialectical materialism. Well, materialism is just science in this context. It's just the scientific method, looking at real material conditions as opposed to mystical or idea-based explanations. So the Marxist explanation of physics is the physics explanation of physics. It's one and the same, right? You take a marble, you throw it against the wall, it bounces. Marxists agree with physicists about how it bounces. First time, second time, third time, all the same. We all agree on that. Material explanation for the behavior of the marble. Now, the problem begins when we try to discuss things dealing with humans in a scientific way, right? If you throw me against the wall, I'm going to say, ouch. If you do it a second time, I'm going to fight you. If you do it a third time, I'm going to start developing suspicious ideas about people in lab coats. And since we have ideas about the world, that affects both how we react to the world and how we think we react to the world. So what's more important then with human society and history and economics and psychology? Is it the material world or the ideas about the world? Philosophers have spent a lot of time debating, is it this or that? Is it our brains? Is it someone else's brain? Is it a great king's brain? Is it God's brain or a spirit's brain? Marx and Engels adapted an approach that combines these two things in a specific way, where while material reality is primary, our ideas can also become material reality in certain circumstances. And this they call dialectical or historical materialism. So when we say Marxism, we really just mean that methodology, plus some of the better writings and analyses put forward by people working with that method, right? So Marxism isn't just what Marx wrote, right? Marx can be wrong, right? We have to, and people who say they're Marxists and say Marx, we have to look and find the answer in Marx, aren't Marxists, at least according to my definition. Okay, the origin of class. What's class? If you look in a standard sociology textbook, it's going to be simple rankings of people, usually by wealth or income or something like that. Marxists look at it differently. We look at class as a system. And if people sometimes use system and the metaphor goes away, a system is think of it as a machine, right? And the machine has two parts, exploitation and oppression. Exploitation is the extraction of wealth from someone else's labor. Oppression is the violence or the threat of violence that makes that both possible and allows it to continue. Oppression without exploitation is just being a jerk. And exploitation without oppression is impossible. Those are the two bases of class. Out of those two things arise the ideologies that justify them or challenge them. Is the system good or bad, just or unjust, right or wrong? Finally, we understand that this is a process in time. It's a dynamic process. Class is constantly being created and recreated, and thus it's constantly under threat of falling apart. The machine keeps trying to break or explode, and oppression keeps hammering it back into shape. Okay. So that's how I want people to think about these things rather than just, the static definitions. So the question for tonight, how did this all start? Okay. How did class start? The standard archaeology, the archaeology 101 model, and somebody can correct me on this, but at least 30 years ago, it was something like this. Humans evolved from apes, splitting off about 2 to 3 million years ago, becoming fully modern about 250,000 years ago, in groups of hunter-gatherers living in relative egalitarian conditions. We spread out from Africa about 60 to 80,000 years ago, finished populating the Americas by 20 to 30,000 years ago. About 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans began domesticating different plants and coming together in settlements. The groups who did this stopped foraging and started farming. Sedentary lifestyle introduced social complexity, and cities began to emerge. The rise of cities and the needs for large-scale projects like irrigation, housing, walls, etc., led to increased social stratification, and presto, the first kings and empires in the beginning of recorded history. The standard Marxist model is actually pretty similar. It goes something like this, that we evolved in egalitarian conditions, what Marx called primitive communism. But instead of looking to social complexity, Marx and Engels identified the creation of a surplus due to increased efficiency of agriculture over hunting and gathering, over foraging. But this low level of production meant that there wasn't a lot of surplus to go around, and so the surplus was seized by the first ruling classes. They'll talk about this stage where first you have this primitive communism, then savagery, which rightly has leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. But it's important to note that Marx and Engels weren't talking about it in a derogatory way. It's just the term they used. And then a barbarian mode of production. After barbarian becomes civilization. And then some Marxists later broke that stage down into things like the slavery mode and then the feudal mode, with other vaguely defined things like the tributary mode or the Asiatic mode that was not really defined at all, thrown in there. For most Marxists, after feudalism comes capitalism, then the inevitable socialist revolution and the withering of the state into full-blown, fully automated luxury space communism. So that's the model. Now, side note, at this point, some people would probably expect me to talk about Engels' origin of family private property in the state. I'm not going to. I'm a rebel like that. I'll leave that to the study group on the book, but I'll only say that it's a really great example of the Marxist method, but it's working with some really old and outdated data. Okay, Engels himself said it needed to be updated 4 years after publishing it. We're now 140 years later with much better data, so it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of stuff needs to be reevaluated. Okay. Now, aside from the last bit about fully automated luxury space communism, the academic and Marxist models line up pretty well. The problem is that once you drill down, neither make a whole lot of sense, honestly. For the academic model, why does complexity lead to kings with wars and prisons and human sacrifice and mass rape and slavery, right? Well, we need to build a ditch, therefore we need, to enslave. What? In response to researchers discovering evidence of societies that don't fit the models, they just keep inventing new categories, subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, and often ultimately rejecting any causality. For Marxists, holding to the old model, it's even worse. First, no one really follows the stages theory anymore. It was considered self-evident in Marx and Engels' time, which is why Engels adopted it. But even then, he was actually trying to make it more flexible and say bits could carry over into the others. And when he talked about Native Americans, he said you can see how a society like this could skip the whole host of class conflict and just go straight into socialism. But the rigid stages theory was actually pushed by Soviet archaeology, not because it was scientifically sound, but because it lent credibility to Stalin's strategy of allying with different bourgeois elements around the world. Oh, you still have a king, therefore you're feudal, therefore you're due for a bourgeois revolution. I'll ally with your bourgeois leaders and make a trade deal. So that it wasn't an effort to understand human history, but to justify Stalin's foreign policy. In addition, since the 70s, we've known that hunter-gatherers often worked only a few hours a day. Marshall Sahlins wrote the original Affluent Society. Usually hunter-gatherers only work about 4 hours a day, have enough to eat and survive and live decent lives. And then after that, we discovered that people in these agricultural cities, supposedly with the surplus, actually suffered far worse health than the hunter-gatherers. So if there's a surplus, why are they suffering? Why are their health outcomes worse? And then there's this little fact that the transition supposedly between hunter-gatherer societies and class societies lasted about 5,000 years, at least. That's longer than all of human history since then, right? So if this is a transition, but it lasted longer than all the supposedly stable things, then what does that say about the model? these supposed real stages. Um, okay, little side note about stages. If you're a Marxist, you mention stages, academics will laugh and say, haha, stupid stages. Um, and mostly they're right, except they're also kind of a little bit hypocritical on that because all archaeologists use the term Stone Age or Neolithic, Mesolithic, Paleolithic, the Chalcolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. They use these stages all the time, and it's because Stone Age comes first, right? There's a progression of scientific discovery that has to happen. Certain things happen that determine or affect what happens next. History happens, time goes in a line. That's just how it works. That doesn't mean everybody will do the same things in the same pattern in the same order, but it does mean that history happens. Um, like I said, in the face of these things, academics generally just stop theorizing entirely. We're just going to describe things rather than theorize about them. But the point of science is actually to explain things, not just to describe. Most Marxists have done even worse, simply reciting the old mantras and becoming increasingly irrelevant. But the new and exciting discoveries cry out to be understood and synthesized. So the past 30 years, we've gotten multiple major attempts. People might remember Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. There was Steven Pinker and the Better Angels of Our Nature. There was Jared Diamond with Guns, Germs, and Steel. More recently, there was Noah Yuval Harari with Sapiens. The problem, these things are not by archaeologists or anthropologists. Fukuyama was a political scientist. Pinker is a psychologist and philosopher-ish kind of person. Noah Yuval Harari was a medieval historian, and Jared Diamond studied birds. So in 2021, academics and radicals got really excited when an honest-to-goodness anthropologist and an honest-to-goodness archaeologist, both with genuine left-wing bona fides, David Graeber and David Wengrow, published The Dawn of Everything. For those who don't know, David Graeber was involved with the Occupy movement. He was the one who came up with the "We are the 99% slogan. He also had a pretty horrible effect on the no demands section of that movement, but that's another story. But anyway, real left-winger, real activist talking about these things. And then Graeber died, but it was published just after he died posthumously. And I do want to say people should read the book. As much as I'm going to say about it, it does have some, it does have some, I kind of use it as a reference guide because it does have a lot of stuff. It covers so much good stuff, but it does have some serious problems. So I'll discuss it in a few minutes, then get to the good stuff. The book starts off with a big question. How do we get stuck in these highly unequal, authoritarian, warmongering societies that we find ourselves in? So to answer that, they deal with three main things. First, I'll do this part one, part two, part three. They start off with the indigenous critique of European social inequality. And here they discuss, and to their credit, they realize this and publish this, and people that there was a Wyandot, a Native American person they call a philosopher, statesman, diplomat named Kandiaronk. This was an actual person. He had been dismissed by most academics as made up by this French author. And this French author's narrative was considered one of the bases of the European Enlightenment that kicked off the Salon movement and the debate movement and all that. Graeber and Wengrow revealed that he was an actual human being. But their claim is that the European Enlightenment is actually the result of European contact with Native American societies and people like Kandiaronk. This is actually a decent argument. I think it's overstated, but it was a refreshing point that he made, but definitely overstated. For instance, Rousseau was born in a republic in Switzerland. Okay. So to say that it's just the result of contact with Native Americans misses the point that this indigenous critique, this indigenous American critique, plugged into an indigenous European critique of that same system. So it was good, but it's also irrelevant to their whole case. They make a big deal of it, but it's really irrelevant to the whole point. Um, Number two, this was about hunter-gatherers and or more generally about our egalitarian past. Here, Wengrow and Graeber engage in some really slimy intellectual sleight of hand. They claim that anyone who says that humans used to live in egalitarian societies is a paternalistic racist who thinks indigenous people were all ignorant simpletons. To prove this point, they don't provide any evidence at all. They just ignore all of our history and say, well, you can't really tell beyond 50,000 years ago. We can tell a lot. They just ignore it and say you can't do anything with it. So it's dishonest. It's insulting to good work done by countless anthropologists. And it's frankly dumb. The idea that groups, even today, that engage in immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, that is, they eat whatever they forage within a few days, they're not only egalitarian, but what anthropologists call hyper-egalitarian with gender equality. And this fact, this association of that kind of mode of production with that kind of egalitarian society is about as close to a true and universally accepted fact in anthropology as it's possible to be. Now, to try to make their case, they use several examples of supposedly egalitarian groups who did in fact institute hierarchies. They point to the pastoral Nuer people who at certain points appointed and started following religious prophets who told them what to do and where to go. They talk about the Nambikwara, who supposedly sometimes were hunter and gatherers, but then had a chief that everyone obeyed. Then they talk about the Lakota, who were hunter gatherers and would have equality and freedom during the winter months. But when they came together in the summer for the buffalo hunts, they had a militarized police force. And four, they point to the Inuit who had gender equality when they gathered together and lived communally in the winter. But in the summer, when they went whale and seal hunting, they had strict patriarchy. So they present things like this and say, see, no pattern. No pattern at all. People just make up their own rules and change them and when they feel like it. The problem, they're wrong. With the Nuer, they ignore the context that the Nuer began following these prophets when they were faced with crises, when imperialists started encroaching on their land in the 19th and 20th centuries, not just because. With the Nambikwara, this is actually astounding, they missed the fact that the researcher they cited, Claude Levi-Strauss, who wasn't interested in their social culture, but in their psychology, Levi-Strauss didn't realize they were actually an agricultural society, and they took the stranger on an extended hunting trip. He just missed the fact that they were an agricultural society, and this has been discussed in the academic literature. Graeber and Wengrow missed it. With the Lakota, they failed to mention that the Lakota had been a horticultural society and had moved back to hunting and gathering when Native American refugees from European colonial expansion started overrunning their lands. They then reinvented themselves after finding and taming feral Spanish horses and proceeded to engage in a century-long war with American colonial settlers. That was why they had a militarized police force, not just because they made it up. Finally, the Inuit, it's actually a really interesting case, and I'll just say that the Inuit are a complex and fascinating culture. They burst out in the Arctic around 1000 CE, and while they didn't use iron directly, they did apparently use a small amount of it to make the tools that made the rest of their tools that allowed them to survive in the hostile Arctic. So their development depended on other groups, trading with other groups that had developed along certain ways. So it's not like the Inuit could have existed in their mode of living 5,000 years ago, right? So they again they failed to mention any timelines on any of this. The overall point here is that Graeber and Wengrow refused to recognize any of these material realities, refused to see these cultures as having any material basis or historical context, because that would get in the way of their thesis. All right, third part. This is actually the most interesting part to me. And that's when they talk about what they basically call democratic cities. They make a really good point that in the academic literature, there's an arbitrary definition about a city versus a village, namely that they define a city as showing signs of being centrally planned and organized. Settlements have been found that are just as large as so-called cities, But if they are not organized and centrally planned in a top-down way, then archaeologists generally don't call it a city. This part is actually, I think, really good. Um, for instance, when the city of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley were discovered, they called them cities, but they kept digging and trying to find the palaces. They couldn't find any palaces. By today's definition, they wouldn't be called cities. They would be called villages, which, if you've seen the ruins, if you've seen the remains, would be ridiculous. But they called them cities at first, so they kind of got grandfathered in. There are some archaeologists who have some serious arguments with the claims they make. And given the shenanigans that Graeber and Wingrove engaged in with hunter-gatherers, I wouldn't be surprised if they made some big errors here as well. But overall, I think there are some really great points that they make about democratic cities. And given what we've discovered, that we keep discovering new cities in various places in the world, I think we're going to find a lot more of these types of things in the future. So given all this, how do Graeber and Wingrove answer the question of how we got stuck? Simple answer, they don't. They punt. Their overall thesis is that there's no pattern to human societies, and while ignoring the first 200,000 years of our history and the 3 million years of evolution prior to that, they claim that whether people are hunter-gatherers, horticultural, or anything else, people just make up their societies. They assert that people are inherently creative, we must have always been creating our social structures. That might make some sense as long as you don't think too deeply, which is probably why the book got praised so much in places like the New York Times and the Atlantic. But people don't wake up one day and decide, hey, let's do slavery. Hey, honey, I'm feeling whimsical. Let's do patriarchy and femicide. Or, hey, emperor, instead of me carrying you on this palanquin, how about we do egalitarianism now? Oh, okay. Right. That's not how anything works. But Graeber and Wingrove think that we did exactly that for thousands of years. And if we're stuck today, they conclude it's because we lack imagination. I'm actually not making that up. When Graeber died before the book being published, but Wingrove did an interview with the Jacobin podcast, which you don't need to listen to. But he claimed that the solution to the current class inequality and oppression was three things. One, the freedom to refuse an order. Two, the freedom to escape oppressive conditions. And three, the freedom to use our imagination. What? An order, if you're free to ignore an order, it's not an order, right? When the ICE Gestapo comes bursting through doors and tearing families apart in the next 2 months, I'm sure it'll be a comfort to the kids to just say, oh, just use your imagination, refuse to obey them, and just escape, right? It's absolutely ridiculous and only makes sense if you're not paying attention to the world around us. All right, now 10 minutes to redo 150 years of Marxism. So do Marxists actually have anything better to offer? I think so, but we need to stop repeating some tired platitudes about stages. So let's start with the first stuff. The academic consensus on our evolution and living in egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies is, I think, absolutely correct. That's the overwhelming evidence keeps supporting that. And in fact, it's probably even more true than many academics believe. Humans evolved in the great ape family, which has some degree of sexual dimorphism. There are other ape families that have essentially zero sexual dimorphism, which by that I mean the difference between male and female in body size, canine size, things like that. So the apes we evolved from had some sexual size differences, but that diminishes from like 140% in some of the great ape species, mountain gorillas and orangutans, to just about 10 to 15% in ours. And part of that might be social and partly based on misgendering. Researchers point to evidence that large males were systematically removed from our gene pools. Well, how do you systematically remove types from a gene pool? Well, they don't reproduce. Chris Baum concludes that this is explained by groups of smaller males cooperating to overpower the would-be bullies. And this is behavior that is seen even today in chimpanzees. The evolutionary biologist Sarah Hurdy points out that there's actually no reason to assume females wouldn't take part in this too. And I think that's absolutely right. Additionally, there's a fascinating book called The Domesticated Penis that makes the case, given our long sexual encounters, female orgasms, and the shape of penises, that it wasn't just bashing bullies' heads in, but also positive sexual selection of males who were not bullies and jerks. The author points out that bonobos, who are our closest relatives in the ape family, solve most of their problems by having sex. And since we are even less sexually dimorphic than they are, it's probably at least as true of us as it is of them. So, no, Professor Graeber, our ancestors weren't playfully engaging in fascism and despotism. They are much more likely engaging in other acts. Um, but also, this also undercuts a long-held assumption by both academics and Marxists that there was a natural sexual division of labor. Um, if we had evolved with natural selection, sexual division of labor, it over the 3 million years of our evolution, it would have shown up in our sexual dimorphism. Instead, both men's and women's shoulders, for instance, have evolved to be able to do an overhand throwing and stabbing motion. If women didn't hunt along with men, there'd be no need for that. Um, all right. So uh, these hunter-gatherer societies were really continent spanning civilization, not civilizations, societies, let's call them. And this is borne out in the genetic record. When we look at the genes of people today, we can often tell that we can pinpoint exact valleys where people's grandparents were born. But when you look at ancient DNA, which admittedly is hard because it does degrade pretty easily in most circumstances, the people in one corner of a continent seem to be pretty similar to people thousands of miles away, except in cases where our ancestors met and had sex with other hominid groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, etc., which actually reinforces the first point that we were busy having sex with lots of people. The spread of tools corroborates this. Groups could be of various sizes, following game. Sometimes they would follow them back and forth. Sometimes they could switch to do something else. They learned how to do things over time. They learned how to make different tools, better tools. The hand axes get smaller and smaller into arrow points and spear points and atlatl points and things like that. And these we share them with others. So the points are the same on one end of a continent versus another. We learned how to do things better, make different tools, shared these with other peoples, had sex, played, danced, sang, told stories, did things, and had art forms we probably can't imagine. If people got annoyed with you, or you got annoyed with them, or even if just you wanted to, you could leave, you could join another group. If people got sick or broke bones, they were cared for, and we know this from human remains where people from tens of thousands of years ago had recovered from broken legs right before they died. That would be impossible if people were just left and not cared for. And yeah, sometimes you'd get a cavity or a small cut would get infected and you would die. We don't want to get overly romantic about the conditions that people lived in, but these are generally the conditions that we did live in for 95% of our existence. So how did this change? That's the big question. Well, we know what they did. So the transition. Again, the transition lasted 5,000 years, more than all of the rest of post-transition combined. There were probably tons and tons of various social formations, many different ways of producing our food and tools, what Marxists call the mode of production. Not just foraging to farming, but semi-nomadism, pastoralism, meaning herding animals, agroforestry, which lots of Native Americans, both North and South America, engaged in aquaculture, meaning you construct weirs and dams and nets. And I know this was true in many places, including Australia, and various mixes of all of these. And I had examples. We don't have time, but there are examples and they're really cool. So just trust me on that. Again, it's a mistake to call these transitional since this period was longer than anything else, but it also implies it was somehow unfinished. And in any case, from a Marxist perspective, all these supposedly solid class formations are actually transitional. For Marxists, class is temporary. it's better to understand these societies. This is what I'm proposing, is that what I would call proto-class societies, generally egalitarian, but starting to show some weird features reflected in the divisions of labor. Now, these could be sexual division of labor or something else. So if you're starting to realize that if you plant certain seeds in certain places, then you can grow them bigger and tastier next year. Well, maybe you need to leave some people at that place to make sure the animals don't eat them all. Maybe just somebody who's tired of walking. Maybe it's older people. Maybe it's different societies could have decided all sorts of different things. Um, but you do start to get divisions of labor then, especially since the level of the development of the forces of production is so low, meaning it's just a development, right? But back in time, you needed a lot of labor to get a little stuff. These proto-class societies are often very fluid and often just end. But instead of reverting, people would retain the knowledge and experience of what had come before. So, for instance, a fascinating thing with Polynesians, when they left Taiwan, they settled new islands as hunter-gatherers, but they had brought taro with them to plant wild. Then over time, as the population increased, other people arrived, or just because they wanted to, the conditions on the island weren't or were particular, they'd start farming again. At some point, when things start getting hectic or weird, or classes start forming, groups would pack up and leave. And so this is how the Polynesians settled the Pacific, right? They went from proto-class or even in some cases class societies to hunter-gatherers, and then to proto-class societies, and then to hunter-gatherers, right? They'd pack up and leave with some taro and find another island and start again. Just a few days ago, there's a book called Patria that talks about the civilizations in the Amazon. Yes, civilizations, major cities in the Amazon prior to European contact. And one of its conclusions is that I haven't read it yet. It just came out, but I listened to an interview, and what it claims is that all the current hunter-gatherers in the Amazon today are actually descendants of farmers who abandoned their cities when Europeans arrived. Okay, so this idea of this proto-class idea helps to explain all the lost civilizations that make academics go crazy. Why would people leave this big, beautiful city? Maybe because the people who ruled it were assholes, right? Maybe because they didn't like being slaves, right? They didn't like being subject to the whims of emperors and priests and just left. But in rare cases, these proto-class societies did convert. How? How, I think, is an empirical question. It probably was pretty unique each time it happened. Um, and there are relatively unique circumstances. But, and this is the key, they would affect everyone else. Okay. So everybody who came in contact with this actual class society that was stuck at spear point, at sword point, now at gunpoint, would have to deal with these full-blown class societies. Class societies love nothing more than conquering other people and making them do work for them. So these hunter-gatherers who previously loved traveling freely and meeting others would have to be constantly on guard against being raided. After years of defending themselves, maybe they decide to raid the cities. They decide to raid the farms and steal the cattle or the goats, right? Presto, we have barbarians, and class society begins to spread. Okay. Now, the point of talking about things like this is because if we're looking for a model, right? That old Marxist model of every society does this, and this. If we understand it this way, then the model is actually rare, right? It only happened a few times, but then affects everything around it. Then the model is rare. If a model is rare, it's not really a model. So instead, what I want people to think about is that instead we have a framework for understanding human history in all its fluid, dynamic, messy developments. And a framework is a better fit for Marxism anyway, which understands history in motion. Um, let's see. Time. Oh, my alarm doesn't go. I'm overtimed. I'm sorry. Um, okay, can I have a few more minutes for women's oppression? Okay, thank you. Okay, where does women's oppression fit into this? I have to say, I'm really skeptical of the model that relies on women's oppression being related to switching from female inheritance and matrilineal descent to male property control, male inheritance, and patrilineal descent. It's really specific and it's based on a few surviving legal documents from the Middle East. And this is related to what I was saying when Ingalls based his ideas on old and outdated data. He just had very few data points. So it's a few surviving legal documents from one corner of the globe. And frankly, I never thought it made a whole lot of sense that the entirety of class structures would be determined by concerns over inheritance. Seems like a lot of trouble to go through to determine who gets your stuff after you're dead. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that so others have seen the problem with this and have proposed what I think are even weirder ideas. I've read sincere Marxists who talked about women's oppression being the result of male sun worship overturning female moon worship because of menstrual cycles. That seems even more very specific with far less evidence. Um, Instead, I think the answer is actually staring us in the face. The origin of women's oppression lies not in who gets property after you die, but who gets it when you're alive, right? If farmers are farming for themselves, there's no need to work any more than you need to survive. You can have as many or as few kids as you want, um, to feed everyone. And if you can't because of environmental circumstances or bad land or bad, you can just go back to hunter gathering, right? But as soon as there's a class society, which by definition requires that a portion of your surplus be taken by the ruling class, then you better produce as much as you can. You have to produce as much as you can. Otherwise, those spear points are going to go through your body. That means that women are then reduced to having kids every year. This actually fits the archaeological and anthropological record. Women hunter-gatherers have tend to have kids every 3, 4, 5 years. Um, uh, Whereas women in agricultural societies uh, have kids every single year. They have kids until they can either no longer give birth or they die. Um, Class society means then polygamy as well. It means that class society requires control of women's reproductive and their productive labor and the future labor of children. This is all to make sure that there's enough to satisfy the needs of the ruling class, who has organized violence to ensure that they do get their surplus. The rise of class society thus requires the oppression of women. I'll skip my whimsical conclusion. But so what I'm proposing here then is really just that we rethink the standard model of Marxism and re-engage with the meaning of Marxism as understanding human society as a process that is complicated, that is in motion, where people are active agents in that history and not passive recipients of either just material conditions or the ideas of great men, and that we as individuals here tonight have a role in changing that in the future.